Let's first look at the first thing, which is about the hierarchical classification of information assets. So, what is the hierarchy of information assets? The concept in the book says that it ensures that the information is correctly marked. Please note, this word marking is very important. Whether it is an information asset file or data, it must be marked. What is marked? It is actually the classification level, which is the protection level of our information assets. In this way, for the corresponding classification level, as we continue to read, only those with the appropriate authorization level can access this information. The object, which is the protected object, our data or files, have a classification level. Our subject, in the future, it will also be classified. The corresponding subject accesses the corresponding object. This is actually the important logic of information security protection. So, when I have a definition of the classification level of the object, then I can protect the data of different levels of the object. This concept is called tagging data. Tagging is two things. One indicates its priority. The other one is for the corresponding priority, we will do corresponding actions for the corresponding classification level, which is to say the corresponding encryption processing. In this way, it is possible to ensure our information assets. Another one is classification. Classification is from the perspective of data processing. For this data, if we just encrypt it, we will do the corresponding confidentiality protection. Some data may not be mainly confidential. Its more important aspect is integrity. That is, our data cannot be lost, such as logs. For logs, their integrity is particularly important. Some data may be very important, that is, we must have a backup. So, for different data processing, we may need to do classification. In the future, on different types of data, we will perform different operations based on different categories. Of course, different categories have different classification levels. So it is two dimensions. One is classification and the other is grading. Different countries or organizations have corresponding laws and regulations for data classification and grading. Here, we will not introduce them one by one. Our country has had a law to protect national secrets a long time ago, which is our secrecy law. It divides our country's data into three levels: top secret, secret, and confidential. In 2021, our country also promulgated data security law because of many new knowledge or technologies such as datasets, data warehouses, including big data, data mining concepts. So it has redefined data. In the past, it may pay more attention to national secrets. Because of the data protection law, we have classified this data, including more detailed classification and grading for commercial data. For our countries, such as military industrial data, its requirements are different. The most typical event is the well-known DD incident. You can search for this on the internet. The halt of DD's listing is actually related to the promotion or issuance of the network protection law. It has we can read some taste. So the country has made great efforts to protect this core data and has special laws. So how is the data graded? In fact, its grading is clearly its importance and value. The importance is actually what we say about the role of the business. The value may be the corresponding cost. What is the role and value it can play for the business? Can it promote the business? Because if some data is lost or leaked, the business may be interrupted. There is also a part of its cost. Of course, this part of the cost is divided into whether it is tangible or intangible. The tangible cost is money. The intangible cost may be some goodwill. Because once some data is lost or leaked, there may be goodwill. The most typical one is for operators. The data of the operator's customers cannot be stolen by outsiders. If an operator has a large amount of customer data and it is captured by others, it is a heavy blow to the operator's business. So we can see that from a business perspective and a cost perspective, both need to analyze the data. Another one is, as we just mentioned, in addition to business value, there is also who will access this data in the future. Different levels of users or admins who operate the data. The operation or application of the data requires corresponding permissions. So data analysis also needs to be based on the subject, which subjects access the data. Once we set the level of the data, different levels of data have different retention times. For example, our country's top secret data has a minimum retention period of 30 years. After 30 years, the retention time of this data is different. For example, the data can possibly be made public after 30 years. Different levels of data have different preservation or encryption periods. Moreover, when the data lifecycle ends, we need to discard the data. Different levels of data have different discard methods. Some data can be made public, while some must be safely destroyed. Even some data carriers require special handling mechanisms. Thus, you will find that it corresponds to later operations, and the handling of data during the entire data lifecycle is completely different. Here comes the question, who will access the data? We need to investigate the relevant parties. That is, from a business perspective, we need to collect the requirements or security requirements for data processing from the relevant parties. The most typical one is the owner, which refers to the security requirements of the data owner for the data. In addition, it is for the users of this data. We, as data operators, from a business perspective, may have some requirements for data entry and data updates. Another one is for the operators or maintainers of the data. In fact, it would be more appropriate to call them DBAs here. For example, database administrators. They may mostly back up data, including data storage. There are some requirements. So, everyone needs to widely collect data security requirements from all parties, including some requirements on data processing mechanisms, because it is obvious security is one aspect. Another one is the business value of the data itself. We can't say that because of security, the convenience or use value of the data is reduced. So it should be the other way around. Under the premise of ensuring data value, how can I provide security for the data? This involves data classification policies, and this data classification policy, obviously it should be defined by the owner. It is defined by our organization or the person who owns the data. Different levels for commercial companies. For example, it has what is called a privacy level. Some data can only be used by themselves. Some data is restricted and can only be used by a small number of employees. Some data is confidential. It may only be used by core or sensitive departments. Some data, it can be made public, like financial reports. It can be made public. Of course, for different companies, their data classification according to the value of their own data, or we define it according to our data usage habits. It's not like national data. From the perspective of national data, different countries have different legal requirements. From a corporate perspective, the owner should take the lead, and then let all data users. We discuss opinions from all parties. We form our own, this classification policy. As we just mentioned, the data owner will decide. We'll define the classification of data. And this data classification, it's not immutable because the data itself is dynamic. Some data may be in this year. It may be valid. For example, before the financial report happens, it is top secret data, right? It may be reflected in the secondary market, our financial report. It may determine the changes in the stock market of the secondary market. But the data of previous years, it's just historical information, right? It can be made public on the internet. So everyone must understand. That is the whole data processing policy, or the logic of this classification. It is actually dynamic. That is to say, it may change. And from the perspective of data security requirements, it must require the policy of data classification, or the method of data classification should be evaluated once a year. That is to say, every year when we audit the company's security strategy, then the owner also has to evaluate his definition of data. Is it okay? In addition, here I have to say, we also need to distinguish between the owner and the high level of the company we mentioned. In fact, the high level is also an owner. He is the owner of the entire organization. So, the high level defines the company's security policy. And this owner, what we wrote here, is actually more of an FM, that is, a functional manager. He is for the data owned and generated by his department to make corresponding regulations and requirements. So during the exam, you need to understand or need to see the question stem. What his question describes is for the organization, the management of the entire assets, or for the data. Generally speaking, he will tell you clearly, my certain business data I need to classify, need to define. It's two different organizational structures, define different security levels. As we just mentioned, the definition of data actually has a standard here. What is involved here is asset management. Let's see what is asset management. In fact, asset management is something you should see a lot in your daily work. It's actually a list. What we are most familiar with is the fixed asset list. For example, through an Excel table or through a IBM software, asset management software, like IBM's Tivoli, right? Or like some commonly used large manufacturers' network software. It has a module itself. Then he manages these assets. Of course, these assets. There are tangible assets. There are also what we call fixed assets. There are also intangible assets, like software license. It needs to be entered into the database. In fact, asset management itself is a database. In asset management, there are actually two things. The first one is what assets I have. What is the second one? There is also a configuration management here. The so-called configuration management is when our assets change. This change tracking and recording of changes. Because every year there will be assets to be scrapped, right? Then we also have newly purchased assets. So this must be reflected in the asset list. Otherwise, there will be a problem. That is, if we are not clear about the changes in our assets during the asset management process, then it is very likely that some important assets will be missed. It is possible that there are many assets in my list that are not here. Another possibility is that some assets have expired, but I still have it in my asset list. Then the cost of management will be very high. So to sum up, in fact, asset management is two parts. One part is that we have a complete and real list. That is, what do I have? What about the other part? It has to reflect the entire change in assets. So this configuration management is also very important. It reflects the change in assets. We just mentioned it, right? In the IT environment. So for asset management, we will have a special module called ITAM. You understand this word is actually an asset list. And in ITAM, it will have several columns. For example, the far left column may be the name of the asset we mentioned. Then the column next to it may be very important in asset management to record the owner of this asset. If you have done the fixed asset name tag, you know, right? Generally, there are three that need to be highlighted. The first is the name of the asset, right? The second is which department this asset belongs to. You have to write out the owner because it owns this asset. Once there is a problem with the asset, we IT people may have to report to this owner. Another part, it's the time this asset went online because many assets have a scrap age limit. For example, some companies may have a scrap age limit of 5 years. Please note that when the 5-year scrap period is up, it doesn't mean that this asset can't be used. It means that this asset can be applied for. That's right, because it has reached the scrap limit. He can apply for new purchases or make this project higher. But if there is no problem with the asset itself, or say it's still in its life cycle, then we can continue to use it, right? I once saw a state-owned enterprise. Really very economical. One is a core switch that has been used for about 20 years, not 20 years. It is a switch that has been in use for more than 15 years. from the perspective of the scrap age limit. It has long passed the scrap cycle, but you will find that it has been running smoothly. Then this asset can be used. But, right, once it breaks down, or for example, we have passed the warranty, the manufacturer has also stopped selling, also stopped operation and maintenance, then we can buy new ones because it has long reached the scrap limit. So this is the value and role of ITAM. Then you just mentioned it. There is a very important module in ITAM that reflects changes in here. This record and track changes. This module is called Configuration Management, called CMDB. If you have used Microsoft's server, Microsoft's server itself comes with a CMDB, that is what we call the Configuration Management Database. It can reflect. In fact, right, every time my assets change, there may be this relative, this version change version. It could be V1, V2, V3, progressing in order. It could be according to a certain time point, right? For example, in July of the 23rd year. Then it arrived, right? The next queue, it might be October of the 23rd year. It will reflect the entire change in assets. Then configuration management. Actually, two aspects. The first is what we said. You have to have a list. What do we need to understand? What about the other part? It reflects the change, every change. This change, including the version after the change. We need to update. In fact, this version is a list. Then every version reflects what state of the asset. Its logic is basically such a concept. Obviously, the entire ITAM management, a very important element is a central relational data warehouse. That is, it is a centralized central relational database. Then you come from various departments or assets from various business lines, right? Whether tangible or intangible, we need to collect and count. So this database itself is maintained by the IT department, but the overall operation and use of the database may come from various business lines or various business departments. So, for example, the most typical pay attention, if it's done well. This IT management is what we call that Microsoft domain. If you have used this Microsoft DC, that is domain control. We know that it will maintain an Active Directory. In fact, the entire Active Directory is a central relational database. It will include all the assets in your enterprise, including your host, account OU, including your server business server. It will be reflected in a tree structure. Then this management first, it's safe because only authorized users or corresponding levels. I can see the whole tree, that is the corresponding level of assets. The second, where is it safe? That is, once a change occurs, I have an account today. Maybe I quit. Then tomorrow, a new employee will come in. Then we can reflect it. So Microsoft's domain Active Directory is a good one. This is an example of asset management. Of course, there are many tools for this kind of management. For example, like the early Novell company's network. It also has a tree inside. Actually, this tree is what we call the tree structure, and it is very similar to Microsoft's Active Directory. Of course, each brand and manufacturer, they will have corresponding management tools or ways of manifestation. Just now, we also mentioned that fixed assets are one aspect. Another part is also very important. That is the license of the software. That is this license, the management of this license. We often encounter concurrency in our daily work. This is actually very troublesome because sometimes it is a neglect in management. I believe that these companies in the Fortune 500, they won't say, because I care about this concurrency and it affects my goodwill. Once my license, for example, if I'm using a pirated version or I didn't buy the corresponding number of this license, then I might be sent a lawyer's letter by many companies. For example, like Adobe or ACD, these companies all send a formal lawyer's letter. Notify us that you may be suspected of using pirated software or the number of your licenses. This is less than the number used. In that case, we must deal with it in time. Otherwise, a problem will arise. That is because of pirated software or our poor license management, or this kind of negligence may be reflected in our financial statements. What will it affect? This place is very important. It will affect goodwill. Once it is reflected in the financial statements, it may become a business reputation, or whether we are talking about the ethics of this organization. So this is very troublesome. So in enterprises or IT departments, there will be a so-called media manager. He usually specializes in managing the number of licenses and how many concurrent users there are. Some companies, they will specifically install this scanner to scan. For example, how many hosts do we have now combined with desktop management or this EDR/ADP software? It will carry out this whole network asset management. The original one, they will also be in desktop management. For example, if you install a certain software, is it genuine? What is the directory of this software installation? It will have data. So it's not as simple that is an asset management module. It may be embedded or combined with other functions. Form a whole. It becomes a dynamic management. So whether it's licensed software or your device, it involves a life cycle. From our needs to our own development. We call it self-research or external procurement. Then go down to the operation and maintenance stage until this device is discarded and retired. In the whole life cycle, the asset should be managed continuously. That is our changes to assets, including the operating status of assets. We need to have a track. So in this way, for the management of this asset, we can effectively control it. What is the most feared? Pay attention. Everyone. The most feared in the whole process is that the asset is already in use in this ID department. That is, it is in an active state. But in our management process or in the process of security control, we didn't find out that it has a problem. It's equivalent to the object existing, but we have no protection or control over this object. This is the most troublesome. So in the whole security management, can there be a real one? There is also a complete one, a real and complete list. This is a very important part of the entire asset management